So we're tying some things together. We're in part two, kind of talking about squat variation to solve a certain problem. I want my torso upright, I want my knees forward, et cetera, et cetera. Recently, we've even talked about counter movement and sort of what counter motions mean sometimes if I don't have good control of my movement from a concentric motion or from a dead start. Do I always have to bounce and rebound? Well, let's talk about how we use squatting in rehab. So full caveat, if you have a knee problem or rehabbing knee problem, you're going to get some variation of squatting every day. That might be 5x5, that might be body weight, we might challenge you, but you're going to squat 5 to 6 days a week. 7 days a week is really my choice, but I'm going to give you a couple freebies. Now, the idea here is that not all squats are the same. And not all squats have to be full range depth or ass to ankle. Of course, should you be able to squat in every position? Yes. Should you be able to handle a large load overhead? Yes. Should you be able to front squat, back squat? Of course. Of course. But one of the things we ripped out of, and something I've been doing now for a long time, when I read Louis Simmons' book, the big book of methods for powerlifting, I was really interested in his idea of the box squat. And I think the box squat has sort of been easily maligned or has sort of fallen out of favor. I'm not here to start a conversation about that. I have plenty of strong friends who do a lot of good box squatting. But what's interesting about the box squat is it does force us to have pause and concentric control. So if you've ever talked to Donnie Thompson, for example, one of the things he likes is that when we do the box squat, he actually has us keep pressure in the feet. So I never ever lose my foot pressure. I'm just pausing and hovering. And you've actually seen this with Laura Phelps or any of the people who've done some heavy West Side box squatting. The boxes got softer and softer and softer, right? So that there was no definitive hard stop. But the reason that that's interesting is the foot pressure gives me a chance to pause, and it forces my athletes to be able to control their range at a certain depth. So if there's a range that I have pain on, or I'm trying to eliminate exposure or minimize risk of a certain depth, or forward translation of the knee, then that box can give me some feedback about the depth and can have me have a place where I can concentrically stop, pause, and I can't bounce to get out of that. So I have to come down, pause, and hover and come back up. One of the reasons I love the box squat, and this isn't a drill about box squatting, but this is an idea that if I am trying to have someone control the shin, which is where we see a lot of sort of sometimes knee pathology or pain related to squatting, where someone's had an ACL tear and we're trying to protect that graft while still getting them squatting and rebuild that neuromuscular program, we do tend to try to keep the shin a little more vertical. So we can use the hamstrings as a mechanism of keeping the shin upright instead of having that shin run forward, which is a way of basically unloading and protecting that ACL, which is one of the things we're trying to do when we develop hamstring control, knee control with our athletes using their hamstrings. So it's one of the reasons we want that knee not to just be soft on the bottom of the kettlebell swing. We want those hamstrings to ultimately control that range of motion muscularly and fascially, so that I'm not just using my ligaments to end my range of motion. So keep in mind that if I'm squatting, keeping my pressure through my feet, where I'm balanced, I'm not going to be on my heels, that at some point I can do a lot of hinging here where I start to get my torso to come forward, still two-hand rules engaged, but I can really keep the shin verticalized. And that's not vertical, that's verticalized, which really does do a couple things. It reduces a lot of shear force on the knee, so I'm getting a lot of femur rotating vertically around a very proud, very tall tibia. Instead of that tibia coming forward, where it starts to introduce more sort of dynamic loads to the knee, which are harder to manage. So if I can keep the shin vertical and hinge around that shin, it's one thing for my athletes to be able to suddenly begin to learn how to control the verticalized knee. I can keep that shin pretty vertical. Don't worry about the knee coming forward. Keep that pressure in the foot, but eventually the shin is going to start to have to track forward. I'm going to run out of room in order to get to depth. Knee is going to come forward, or I'm going to have to round my back, right? So I can get my athletes to keep a pretty verticalized shin while squatting. Now, the key here is that I'm also interested in their control coming back up, and that tying that idea of that counter motion back in. It's really interesting because if someone has knee pain or history of patellar tendinopathy, again, we can get really simplified motion under control with tempo, and then the reversal is them standing back up and having control of that hamstring. Just like when I hit apex on a swing, I don't want to see a counter motion of a spring to come back up. I just want to see everything stand up and close to the midline so that I pause at a depth, and this may be really high. This may be as high as we squat with our athletes when they're in rehab. Pause, and then to come back up, I shouldn't see the knee come forward. So I'm looking at that knee coming, having control, but noticing, keeping the shin vertical, trying to control that verticalized shin. Probably going to be easier to have a load on the back, which is why we use that back squat, comfortable high bar, low bar position. High bar position gives me a little bit more forward upright torso demand and more load on the knee. Low back squat allows me to have the torso forward, shin vertical. But the low bar back squat is one of the patterns we use in the box squat as part, or a pause squat is probably a better term for it, as part of a rehab process. And this is one of the ways we begin to think about some of the choices that we're making with bar selection, with torso placement. One of the reasons we love the transformer bar is that we can, with very simple, without having to teach a lot of complexity, or if we don't have to get a lot of shoulders involved, we get the transformer bar into position and then adjust where we have the load, which allows us to challenge and chase torso position, which has really interesting implications on what goes on with the knee. So again, if you have a person with knee history of problems in the knee or pain in the knee, one of the things you can do is let that torso come forward and really control the shin angle. And in this situation, the box squat was a great idea because it allowed us to really end up controlling the shin and keep that shin vertical, which is one of the ways to manage some of the shear forces and which are potentially irritating, or we're trying to rehab or protect or minimize that shear. So this is why the physicians sometimes said, don't squat below 90. What they meant was below 90, we start to see a lot more forward knee shear, but we can keep that shin vertical, femur rotating around a really vertical shin. That means it's going to be something that looks a little bit more like a box squat. Hopefully this has given you some insight into how we think about squatting, less about what muscle group we're using, more about what's going on with the joint, what are we trying to do, what's our intention. See you tomorrow.